Honors, lovely. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to what is the last of our sessions, our 10th session for this year's ACJS conference, devoted to Canadian Jewish history. 2 is the title. I'm your chair, Hernan Tesler-Mabé, and we have 3 presentations today, 3 panelists, Tyler Wentzell, Saundra, Lipton, and Irving Rosen. And what we'll be doing is I will introduce them in turn in this order. I'll give a brief biographical sketch for each of our presenters, the title of their paper, and then they'll have, I'll ask that each of the presenters limit their comments to, or their presentations to 20 minutes. That should leave us plenty of time for questions at the end. And I will be notifying you in the chat when there are 5 minutes and 2 minutes left on your watch. So please just have a look at the chat on that. So let me begin. Tyler Wentzell is from the University of Toronto. He is an SJD candidate, which is PhD in law at the aforementioned university and the Faculty of Law. His research focuses on anti-fascism, fascism, and communism in the interwar years, and the use of military force and intelligence for internal security tasks. His first book, Not for King or Country, Edward Cecil Smith, The Communist Party of Canada and the Spanish Civil War, was published by the University of Toronto Press in 2020. And the paper he will be delivering is entitled The Vanguard of the Vanguard of the Vanguard, love that, Revolutionary Jewish Youth in Interwar Toronto, Montreal, and New York. The floor is yours, Tyler. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So give me 1 second here as I sort out myself with my PowerPoint. All right, can everyone see that? Yeah. All right, here we go. All right, so the League for a Revolutionary Workers' Party was a small Marxist-Leninist organization based mainly in New York, Toronto, and Montreal from 1934 until 1940. The organization comprised working-class intellectuals drawn initially from the University of Toronto and Columbia University students, almost all of whom were Jewish, about 95% or so, children who had been born in Canada to recent arrivals from Eastern Europe. These young men and women, it was about 50-50 gender split, saw themselves as the vanguard of the vanguard of the vanguard, or V3 in their correspondence. Took me forever to figure out what V3 meant. They saw themselves as the only true communists, more Bolshevik than the communist parties or the Trotskyists. They were going to steer the revolution. Today, I'm going to share with you my research on this group, which draws on extensive research into the personal papers of the membership, most of which was laying unexamined in the basements of the family members. These incredible records really tell an intricate story of this it was a small organization. It wasn't very big. It was only 100 people or so, but because the familial intertwining was so extensive, you have the letters going from one person to the other person, as well as the replies in a separate archive in a separate basement. So it's very detailed. And it's very notable, I found, that when I tried to find out where all these people went and what they did, that these people who led this really repressed life faced so much anti-Semitism and repression in their life in urban Toronto, Montreal, New York, later proved themselves to be just so brilliant. Then they felt so suffocated by the poverty of the Great Depression and the anti-Semitism they faced, that at the time they saw no other option in their lives besides working in the garment industry for the most part, even if they got a university education. And I found this to be just a really interesting aspect of the revolutionary mindset of the time. So first, a little bit of a family tree of the League for a Revolutionary Workers' Party. Canada and the United States had long histories of socialist and communist parties, but the Communist International Line Party, the Communist Party of Canada, was established in 1921. This photo is taken in 1925. It shows 4 key leaders of the party. On the left is Tim Buck, and then William Moriarty and Jack MacDonald. On the right is Morris Spector. There were other Jewish leaders in the Communist Party, Joseph Salsberg in particular, but Spector really represented the Jewish workers in Toronto, the students and the intellectuals within the party at the time of its birth. Spector was an absolute force of nature, editing both the party's newspapers and being the first of only 2 Canadians ever elected to the executive committee of the Communist International in Moscow. But by the early 1930s, this was Tim Buck's party. Buck shrewdly chose the right side in Stalin's purges in the Soviet Union and used it as a means to seize power within the Communist Party. Everyone but Buck, pictured here, was soon purged from the party. Spector was the first. He refused to denounce Leon Trotsky rather than declaring himself to be a supporter of Leon Trotsky. He just refused to denounce him, and he lost his executive appointments and party membership. And soon he became one of the key North American leaders of the Trotskyist movement, also known as the left opposition. The left opposition in Canada and the United States was tightly integrated. At first, it was a single party with one headquarters in New York, with a newspaper printed in New York. Spector grew the party in Toronto, where he attracted mostly Jewish adherents. That was his circle. Now, the Trotskyists, or the International Left Opposition, that's the ILO you'll spot on the signs here, initially did a fair amount of work among student groups and existing Jewish labor organizations. They mostly controlled the University of Toronto's Student League, the first openly Marxist organization on campus. In March 1933, Trotsky himself wrote them a letter of congratulations. This proved a bit premature, as the Communist Party had seized control of the organization before the summer. The Trotskyists really only held control of the organization for about 6 months. Pictured in these images here is what is likely the Canadian Trotskyists' biggest accomplishment of the early 1930s. Spector and his key allies took leading roles in the Jewish United Front Against Fascism and its massive rally in Toronto protesting Adolf Hitler's government. Held in the summer of 1933, it organized more than 100 different groups, mostly a mix of Jewish working class organizations, such as the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and a variety of tailor, furrier, and hat-making unions and other organizations. They put down their tools in the garment district and marched on Queen's Park, swelling to a total of 15,000 participants. It was the largest rally of its kind in Toronto since 1919. Now, even within Spector's rather homogenous organization, the left opposition in Toronto, schisms began to emerge between the young intellectuals and students and the older, more proletarian members, chiefly tailors and furriers. The young ones, largely students at the University of Toronto, their partners and friends, wanted to be more actively pursuing the revolution. They thought Spector was unduly distracted by his pursuit of a law degree at the time at Osgoode Hall. So they looked elsewhere for leadership and found the gentleman on the telephone in the center of the photograph here. B.J. Field, his real name was Max Gould, was a commodities broker in New York City. He became the Trotskyists' economist, and he was twice kicked out of the movement for his lack of party discipline. He refused to disclose his syllabus for his student groups, and he ignored party direction when he led the 1934 New York hotel workers strike. That's what this photo is. The first time the Trotskyists kicked him out, Field, because he had the money, he traveled to Turkey and personally visited with Leon Trotsky, gained his trust, gained his vote of confidence, and he was allowed to rejoin the party. The second time he got kicked out, he stayed out. Trotsky did not intervene that time. Now, Field formed his own group, hoping to unite all Marxists outside of the Trotskyist and Communist Party fold, a whole bunch of small organizations about which there's not a lot written. He called it the League for a Revolutionary Workers' Party, and the young Jewish students and intellectuals in the Canadian Trotskyist movement flocked to his banner. The Canadian LRWP was soon much larger than the Canadian Trotskyist movement, and it had branches in Toronto, Montreal, and London, Ontario. Left of the communists and Trotskyists, hence they called themselves the Vanguard of the Vanguard of the Vanguard. The New York branch never amounted to much more than a study group with a prominent figurehead in charge. B.J. Field led the international group, but he did little more than bring mostly Jewish brilliant students from Columbia University and City University in New York to discuss economics through a Marxist lens. The real action was up in Canada, where the membership were almost hyperactive in their approach. Never numbering more than 100 members, they acquired a printing press of their own and produced 2 newspapers for the adult group and another for the youth group. Of course, it's laughable that there was a youth branch in an organization when the average age was probably about 22, but the Revolutionary Youth League came about when the LRWP members infiltrated several Toronto branches of the Cooperative Commonwealth Youth Movement in an effort to radicalize it. When their efforts were discovered, they were thrown out. So the members declared victory and said that they had left the Cooperative Commonwealth Youth Movement in order to form a new, sufficiently revolutionary group. It was a bit of a fiction that usefully made this group of 100 or so people seem much bigger than it actually was. Members rode the rails as far west as Vancouver and San Francisco and as far east as Quebec City. They tried to infiltrate the mines in Noranda, Quebec, and they met with some success among shoe workers. On the right image here, this is Israel Levine. He went by David West, which was one of his many fake names. He worked with Aubrey Joel in organizing a shoe worker strike in Montreal. In the photo, he had just been punched in the face by a police officer. Soon after, he and Joel went to London as ringers to infiltrate another shoe worker strike there, and they organized workers and physically fought and intimidated the strikebreakers. This group even sent their Canadian chairman, William Crame, to Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War, and he worked with the left wing of the PUM, the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, and tried to radicalize them. During the May Days of 1937, think homage to Catalonia here, Crame was arrested by Republican authorities and later deported. The LRWP were also members of the broader anti-fascist movement. When this, the 2 images here, was going on inside Massey Hall, here's what was going on outside. This is Bill Crame, not long returned from Barcelona, about to be arrested by Constable Wilfred Gillen of the Toronto Police. The LRWP organized a broad coalition of socialists, anarchists, non-communist party communists, and all kinds of other anti-fascists that protested outside Massey Hall during the first public National Unity Party rally. 3 members of the LRWP were arrested that night, as well as a 4th man who was probably LRWP, but I can't confirm that. The LRWP had already run a similar counter rally like this against the Canadian Union of Fascists, and expecting arrests, they had fundraised for their legal defense. They hired none other than Joseph L. Cohen, the celebrated labor lawyer. And by the way, I think this provides pretty definitive evidence that Cohen was not a secret member of the Communist Party of Canada, as many have alleged. If he was, he would almost certainly not have been allowed to defend these Trotskyists who the Communist Party were actively denouncing for their tactics of directly opposing the fascists. As the Second World War approached, the LRWP remained active in Toronto and Montreal. They held anti-war rallies and anti-fascism rallies and protested the padlock law in Quebec. They had soapbox speakers in Toronto and Montreal street corners. But when the war broke out, the Canadian group folded up. Some children, the members, have stories of their parents telling them about hiding their documents, about the RCMP showing up at the secret location of their printing press, obviously not as secret as they thought it was, and telling them to cease operations. And they did. Remarkably, this group that had been so devoted to the revolution folded pretty easily. There's no documents to support this, but stories from the children indicate that there was a sense that as important as they believed the cause of revolution was, the nearer term objective of defeating Nazism loomed larger. They were against war generally, and they still saw war as largely being an imperialist endeavor, but Nazism just needed to be stopped. So few of the members participated in the war, but they did not actively seek to undermine it either. And it's fair to say that they were legitimately afraid of being arrested. A few of them snuck into the United States. Bill Crame went to Mexico. Now, we all know that anti-Semitism did not disappear at the end of the war, far from it, but there were new opportunities for Jews in Canada and the United States, and greater prosperity, broadly speaking, that applied to everyone and brought with it new opportunities. And this seems to have had the most significant de-radicalizing influence on the members of the LRWP, and frankly, an unlocking of the human potential that resided in this group of really brilliant young people. Before the war, most members saw their best case scenario as a good job in the garment industry. Even if they got a university education, they might rise to perhaps get a management position, but that's really the most they saw in the world ahead of them. These barriers, artificial barriers, in spite of their intelligence and work ethic, fueled their revolutionary sentiment. And when these barriers lessened, not disappeared, when these barriers lessened, so too did their revolutionary fervor. I'm going to give you some examples of some especially notable members. This is Israel Levine, or David West, and later David Martin became the name he went by legally. Levine had been one of the most active members of the LRWP. During the war, he worked as a journalist with the BBC, where he worked with George Orwell, and then he joined the Royal Canadian Air Force and flew to quotas in Asia. He secretly worked as a journalist even while he was still in the Air Force, producing some of the most cutting-edge materials on the conflict in Yugoslavia. He became the national chairman of the International Rescue Committee after the Second World War. He did the fundraising for Admiral Byrd's fifth and final Antarctica expedition. And then he worked as an aide for Senator, later Congressman Thomas Dodd. Among other things, he proposed and wrote the first drafts of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and became one of the leading experts on Yugoslavia. He had a truly incredible life. Some other examples. Harry Orlinsky, he's on the right. He was the first editor of the LRWP's newspaper, The Worker's Voice, where he was identified as S. Hardy. Orlinsky became a skilled linguist. He was the only Jewish member of the Protestant National Council's Revised Standard Version and the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. He was also the editor-in-chief of the New Jewish Publication Society's 1962 retranslation of the Torah, and he was the linguist hired by Israel to confirm the authenticity of the Dead Sea Scrolls. On the left, that's Bill Crane, who I had the pleasure of interviewing when he was a spry 104 years old. He became Time Magazine's bureau chief in Latin America and one of CBC's very first television news anchors. But he was perpetually hounded by the RCMP, so they would show up, talk to his boss, and he would coincidentally lose his job. So he went into business for himself. He couldn't work for someone else, he'd work for himself. And he created O'Shanter Development Company Limited, which is now one of the largest rental property developers in Toronto. He also created his own think tank on monetary reform. Some other examples, James Daly, who's not Jewish. In fact, he was the first non-Jew that I've mentioned today. He was Irish. He became a copywriter at Q.C. McLean Publications during the war, and he shot right to the top of that company. When the company was bought out by Southern Business Publications, he just kept climbing and he became its president, and he gave jobs to a lot of his old LRWP friends. Aubrey Joel, who was part of the shoemakers strike in Montreal and had rode the rails to Vancouver and San Francisco, for instance, was in need of work after his father's fur shop had burned down without sufficient insurance to stand it back up again. Joel succeeded Daly as the president of Southern Business Publications in 1969. And Daly, by the way, was on the board of the Donalda Golf Club when it became the first mixed golf club in Toronto to permit Jewish members. Aubrey Joel and other members of the LRWP very much enjoyed taking up golf and taking advantage of the business networking opportunities it afforded, although they were still barred from many other private clubs in Toronto. A few observations on the subject of gender here, which I mentioned briefly at the beginning, but the Canadian LRWP was remarkably balanced in terms of gender, about 50% men and 50% women. This was much, much higher degree of participation by women than in the Communist Party or in the Trotskyist movement. And in the LRWP, the women played very active roles. They were writers, editors, typesetters, and soapbox speakers. And not surprisingly, when you have a group that's 50-50, young men and women, some romance blooms. So examples, 3 Cowan sisters. The family had changed its name from Cohen, it became Cowan. They were all members of this group. And all 3 married male members of the LRWP. Gladys Cowan married Bill Crane. Ray Cowan married Aubrey Joel. Dorothy Cowan married Moy Bonham, who I haven't mentioned today, but he was the group's treasurer. And then there were the 3 Borsuk siblings, Ben, Judith, and Eve. Eve married LRWPer Sam Gamble. Judith married Moy Bonham's younger brother, Neil, although I don't know for sure that Neil was a member of this group. That's certainly how they met. Ben Borsuk, the group's main economics writer, married LRW peer Dorothy Friedman, who was a popular soapbox speaker. So there's a lot of courting and marriage and familial links that persist today. No doubt, by virtue of having so many active women members, the LRWP engaged significantly with what were viewed at the time as women's issues, such as the price of bread and milk, reproductive rights, and equality inside the home and out. These topics were dealt with by the Communist Party and the Trotskyist movement. However, it plays a much larger role in the literature of the LRWP produced.
2 minutes, Tyler.
How many? Sorry?
Sorry to interrupt. 2 minutes.
2 minutes, right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to just sum up on a few points. I have a lot to say about this organization and happy to talk more. This is the first historical plaque that Heritage Toronto and I have been working together to produce. It's going up on Dundas Street in June to celebrate the Crame family, which included Bill Crame, the director of the group. It's got his photo of him protesting outside Massey Hall, and his sister, Ida Crame, who became a very famous concert pianist. And this plaque will go outside of the family's fur shop that was in the West End of Toronto. Going to pause for, we'll do questions together at the end. I'm going to make a pitch, an appeal for support. I have written a book on this subject, on the League for Revolutionary Workers Party. It is in for peer review with the University of Toronto. It needs reviewers, and the University of Toronto Press is having a serious trouble finding reviewers for a lot of their books right now. If you are the sort of person who would be well suited to be a reader for a manuscript like this, if you would like to do that, please let me know or contact Len Husband at the University of Toronto Press directly. I'll put his email in the chat, and you can have a free copy of the manuscripts and read it and give feedback and hopefully help advance this project to entering the public domain. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tyler. Perfect, and thank you for keeping to time. Sorry, I hope I didn't interrupt too much.
Nope.
Fascinating topic, and I'm looking forward to the question period that will follow. Sorry, I'm just going to put myself back on the screen. So let's move on to the second speaker. So what we'll do, I'll put 5 minutes in the chat, but then Saundra, I will notify you when you're at 2 minutes, and hopefully that will allow you to wrap up. So our second speaker is Saundra Lipton from the University of Calgary. Saundra is a retired academic librarian, retired but busy academic librarian. She is president of the Jewish Historical Society of Southern Alberta. She has wide-ranging research interests and currently maintains the Simone Weil bibliography, the Religious Studies web guide, and is also involved in researching the stories of the Jewish Canadian women who served in the Canadian military forces of the Second World War. And all of those links are on our program. So if you'd like to look these things up, you can do so. And Saundra will be presenting a paper entitled, "Let My People Go, Gatherings in Calgary in Support of the Free Soviet Jewry Movement." And I give you 20 minutes to share your talk. Thank you, Saundra.
Thank you. Okay, can everyone see my screen there? Great. Yes. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to speak to you. I'm going to first off start off with a little bit of background on the Soviet Jewry movement. Soviet immigrant Isabella Tabarovsky, in a 2019 opinion piece in the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, describes the Free Soviet Jewry movement as, quote, "a glorious episode in the history of North American and global Jewish history. It is a story we could do well to remember," unquote. In the 1960s, 3 million Jews, 1/4 of the total worldwide Jewish population, lived in the Soviet Union. Since 1924, when Stalin became the leader, synagogues and Jewish schools had been closed, Hebrew and Yiddish publications were banned. citizens were virtually prohibited from leaving the Soviet Union. Inspired by Premier Kosygin's 1966 statement that the Soviet Union would allow citizens to leave in order to join family living outside the country, and Israel's victory during the Six-Day War in 1967, some Soviet Jews began to apply for immigration visas for Israel. While a few were successful, many had their applications denied, and they became known as refuseniks. Refuseniks faced a number of challenges. Calgary Russian immigrant Anna Gelt, in her oral history recorded by the Jewish Historical Society of Southern Alberta, notes that once she and her husband applied to leave the Soviet Union in 1975, they both lost their jobs. They were considered as betraying their country by applying. They also lost their home rented through the government and had to move in with their parents. Refuseniks also experienced random searches of their apartments. Jewish books or religious texts were confiscated, and telephones were often disconnected. Some were arrested and sent to prison, labor camps, or exiled to Siberia. Soviet Jews who wanted to learn about Judaism, practice Jewish rituals, and study Hebrew did so in secret and at great risk to themselves. At the end of the 1960s, works such as Elie Wiesel's Jews of Silence highlighted to the Jews in Canada and around the world the difficult situation of their Soviet brethren. Starting in the early 70s, Canadian Jews from all walks of life began writing press releases, painting signs and banners, attending rallies, sending letters, telegrams, and petitions, etc., in an attempt to harness the power of the media to educate the wider Canadian community, to provide support to Soviet Jewry, and to pressure the Soviet government into letting the Jews leave. This tremendously successful international social action campaign eventually saw over 1.5 million Soviet Jews finally freely allowed to leave the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. The Canadian efforts to support the struggles of Soviet Jewry have received limited attention in the literature. While Harold Troper has published four articles, one co-authored with Morton Weinfeld, that include information on this struggle, and the annual American Jewish Yearbook for the period 1968 to 1992 annually notes activities in Canada in support of this major social action campaign, there are only 2 studies devoted to this topic. Wendy Eisen's 1995 work, Count Us In, and the 1993 thesis by Mindy Averick-Skapinger, Canadian Jewish Involvement with Soviet Jewry, 1970 to 1990, the Toronto Case Study. In this available literature, the focus is on activities in Ontario, with only very brief mention of events in Calgary and Alberta. The Calgary efforts on behalf of Soviet Jews were primarily supported by the women of the community and can be categorized into 3 main areas: advocacy through petitions to the governments of Canada and the Soviet Union, public awareness campaigns to Jewish and general community, and support to refuseniks through adoptions, bar and bat mitzvah twinnings, phone calls, and letters. Scream Today or Feel Guilty Tomorrow was a headline in a 1978 issue of the Calgary Jewish News. Through explorations of archival material and newspaper articles and interviews with former activists, this presentation will focus on local Calgary initiatives to increase public awareness of the situation of Soviet Jewry through organized public gatherings. For a decade and a half, from 1970 to 1986, numerous gatherings were held in Calgary, many attended by hundreds from the Jewish and general community. Despite lacking a local Soviet embassy or consulate to protest in front of, various members of the Calgary community took it upon themselves to organize rallies and protests to educate and engage the Jewish and general Calgary community and the media in the fight for Soviet Jewry. Calgary community appears to have first begun its Soviet Jewry advocacy in 1970, with initial efforts spearheaded by the Calgary youth. In the early part of the 1970s, Jewish Community Council partnered with other organizations in support of Soviet Jewry. News reports I have located indicated that at least by 1974, Council had established a subcommittee to lead community activity in this area, the Calgary Committee for Soviet Jewry. Local activities were also organized by Calgary Jewish women's organizations, Hadassah Witzo and the National Council of Jewish Women, and Synagogue Sisterhoods, Jewish youth groups, and B'nai B'rith. In addition, the local synagogues collaborated in initiatives and highlighted the plight of Soviet Jewry to their congregations. Events featuring phone calls to refuseniks in the Soviet Union became ways to heighten community awareness of their situation and to create personal connections. The calls also provided moral support for the refuseniks. Calls were made from Calgary on a number of occasions during the 70s and 80s. It was not easy to make these calls. It required a reservation and the cooperation of the Soviet operator. Additionally, all calls were monitored by Soviet censors. The image in this slide is of Dr. Frankel speaking to refusenik Michael Lomonosov in 1983. The Calgary newspaper, The Jewish Star, made a number of calls from their office and invited the public to participate in these conversations. The first rally I've identified is this November 1970 event promoting public awareness of the injustices faced by Soviet Jews. It was initiated by young Judean Mark Brager. The Community Relations Committee of the Calgary Jewish Council gave its approval and pledged support. It was held at the Stephen Avenue Mall, downtown Calgary, and attracted 200 people, according to a report in the Calgary Herald. This December 1970 protest was triggered by the Leningrad trial. In June 1970, 14 refuseniks and 2 non-Jewish dissidents devised a plan to seize a small aircraft and fly to freedom. These activists were willing to risk their lives in the hope that even if the plan was unsuccessful, it would demonstrate to the world the desperate situation of the Jews in the Soviet Union. On the morning of the planned hijacking, the members of this group were all arrested and put on trial in Leningrad. December 24, 1970, 2 were sentenced to death and the others were sent to labor camps for 8 to 15 years. Rallies and vigils were held across Canada, including in Calgary. Here we see youth representing all the various Jewish youth groups coming together to protest. A very large protest rally was held in January 1971 at Western Canada High School. The Calgary Herald notes that nearly 500 people attended. Organized by Maurice Paperny, a leader in both the Jewish and non-Jewish community, and co-sponsored by the Jewish Community Council and the Canadian Council of Christians and Jews Western Region, it featured a number of religious and political leaders, including Calgary Bishop Paul O'Byrne and Calgary Mayor Rod Sykes. In 1971, during Russian Premier Alexei Kosygин's visit to Canada, rallies were held at all his stops across the country. 150 Calgarians in 40 vehicles met at the Beth Israel Synagogue at 5 a.m. on Sunday, October 24, 1971, and caravanned to Edmonton to join with members of the Edmonton community to protest the treatment of Soviet Jewry. The group gathered in a field along the highway just outside Fort Saskatchewan to wave signs as Kosygin sped past on his way to and from a short visit to a nickel refining plant. The protesters then joined a rally of about 500 individuals at a synagogue in Edmonton. In 1975, Calgary-born Sophie Kettner, a leader in the local Hadassah Witzo, organized a rally which featured an address by a recent Jewish immigrant from the Soviet Union. A rally held in the summer of 1978, organized by the Calgary Committee for Soviet Jewry, collected 1,000 signatures on a petition asking the Soviet Union to abide by the Helsinki Accords. This image is of a 1979 event to raise public awareness of the situation of refuseniks, such as the Slepak family, through a community walk. Clergy from the conservative and Orthodox synagogues, along with Calgary Mayor Ralph Klein, a local Soviet Jewry activist Serena Cohen and Karen Bahar, and a recent Soviet immigrant Ismail Plastik were featured participants at a 1982 Hanukkah rally held at the steps of City Hall. One very effective tactic to raise general public awareness was to set up demonstrations at local events featuring Soviets. 1974 appears to have been a year of considerable opportunities for this in Calgary. In May 1974, 10 grade 9 Calgary Hebrew School students and their 3 chaperones drove to Spokane, where they spent 2 days at Expo 74. At Expo, they joined the locally organized efforts to highlight the situation of Soviet Jewry. The students spent their first day wearing their free Soviet Jewry t-shirts at the Soviet Pavilion and distributing pamphlets to the fairgoers. Approximately 30 members of the Jewish community, primarily high school students, distributed pamphlets to attendees arriving at the Calgary Stampede Corral for a June 1974 event featuring the Russian gymnasts. This protest was organized by the Calgary Committee for Soviet Jewry. That same year, Calgary Hadassah Witzo organized a demonstration outside the Calgary performance of the Bolshoi Ballet, and 3 years later, in 1977, Hadassah members conducted a boycott of the Moscow Circus, dressing in black and passing out pamphlets. A number of former refuseniks and family members of refuseniks spoke to the Calgary Jewish and broader community in order to generate support. In February 1973, the National Action Committee for Soviet Jewry sponsored Mrs. Esther Markish on a speaking tour. In Calgary, 150 people heard her talk about her life as a refusenik. Her husband, Peretz Markish, was a Yiddish poet who was among the over 400 Jewish writers killed during Stalin's leadership. A decade later, in November 1983, B'nai B'rith League for Human Rights Calgary chapter and the local Jewish newspaper, the Jewish Star, sponsored a program to encourage the community to lobby on behalf of Soviet Jewry. Speakers included Dr. Jim Jones from the University of Calgary, who the Jewish Star noted, quote, is interested in and has closely followed the refusenik movement, unquote. In an email correspondence, Dr. Jones informed me he had spent a decade in the Soviet Union, during which time he became friends with refuseniks, attending the Simchat Torah celebrations, and even bumping into Elie Wiesel on the streets of Moscow and being introduced to Wiesel by his refusenik friends. In 1986, 30 university students caravanned across Canada, holding 2 weeks of protests on behalf of Soviet Jewry in 16 cities, including Calgary. On May 23, 1986, the group held a rally at Calgary City Hall, where, dressed in striped prisoner uniforms, they symbolically staged a burial ceremony for the Soviets' anti-Jewish practices. At the rally, Mojo Williams, president of the Alberta Association for the Advancement of Colored People, encouraged the students to continue their protests and petitions as effective means to apply international pressure on the Soviet government to end discrimination against the Jews. From the rally, the students visited the Jewish Day School and then spent the weekend in Calgary. As the caravan departed Calgary, the community began a walkathon dedicated to the assistance of oppressed Jewry. As noted, support for Soviet Jewry also came from politicians, clergy, and others outside the Jewish community. Academics in the wider community were also involved in activities to help free Soviet Jewry. At the September 1984 Calgary meeting of the 11th International Congress for Tropical Medicine and Malaria, papers by 2 refusenik scientists, Dr. Goldfarb and Dr. Uspensky, were presented in absentia. Over 230 participants from 36 countries were signatories on petitions requesting that the President of the Academy of Medical Sciences of the USSR help grant these scientists and their families exit visas so they can continue with their careers. Also, in 1984, the Calgary chapter of the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem sponsored a talk at the Calgary's Emmanuel Church by Jay and Mary Dahl Rowling about their project to create a film highlighting the plight of Soviet Jewry through interviews with refuseniks. While the interviews had been filmed in secret during a 1984 visit in Russia, the KGB had somehow gotten wind of the project and seized the film footage. Fortunately, the Rawlings had hidden a second copy, and the filmmakers were later able to get it smuggled out of the Soviet Union and use it to make the films Gates of Brass, released in Canada in 1985. You can view this film on YouTube. The success of these rallies, demonstrations, and phone calls, as well as the petitions, letter writing campaigns, etc., in bringing this issue to the attention of all Calgarians, is reflected in the significant number of articles in the Calgary Herald on Soviet Jewry during the 70s and 80s. It is interesting to note that as early as 1950, the Calgary Herald is publishing articles highlighting the plight of Soviet Jewry. Within the Jewish community, readers of the Calgary Jewish News, published by the Calgary Jewish Community Council from 1962 to 1988, and the Jewish Star, published by Doug Wertheimer from 1980 to 1990, would have noticed many articles on Soviet Jewry. The local newspaper, the Jewish Star, was particularly active in reporting on the situation of Soviet Jewry, and has been previously noted, this newspaper was also involved in organizing public events. In the late 1980s, with the change in Soviet immigration policy and following the dissolution of the Soviet Union on December 25, 1991, the widespread oppression of Jewish religion and culture ended, and the gates of the country opened for free immigration to Israel and other Western countries. For almost 20 years, a small cadre of dedicated Calgarians devoted much time and effort to the Social Action Campaign to Free Soviet Jewry. Organizing public gatherings to keep this social justice initiative at the forefront of the Calgary public was a key component of this campaign. For a relatively small community of around 6,000 Jews in 1980, these efforts represented significant promotion of the situation of Soviet Jewry to the Jewish community and the larger Calgary community. I salute all those in Calgary and around the world who work so hard on this important social justice initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Saundra. So interesting. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the questions bring up. And let me now turn to our final speaker. This would be Irving Rosen, who will be presenting, well, he's from the University of Toronto, and he'll be presenting a paper entitled The Rise and Fall of Joseph Baruch Salsberg, the Seer of Spadina. And let me just provide you a little bit more information on Irving. Irving earned an MD at the University of Toronto Medical School, as well as a postgraduate education in surgery at the same institute. A surgical fellowship followed at New York's Memorial Center for Malignant Disease. He's currently a professor in the Department of Surgery at U of T. He has long retired from active surgical practice. I didn't write that, he did, and pursues research in the history of medicine as well as Canada's Jewish community. Thank you, Irving, and we look forward to your talk now. Thank you. You have 20 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are lucky that our forebears had the wisdom, the luck, or whatever, to come to Canada. Thanks to the notion of population augmentation by immigration, championed by Laurier and Sefton, through the promise of free land in the beautiful West. Joseph Baruch Salsberg, JBS, 1902 to 1998, had to wait 2 extra years while his devout father accumulated sufficient funds to bring wife and family over in 1913 and settle in Toronto's famous slum, the Ward. Expected to be a yeshiva bocher, here he is in the front, just to the right of the rabbi. He left Lansdowne Public School after 2 years to become a factory worker in the schmata business. His father was rich in Torah, poor in business. The family needed nourishment. JBS was unschooled, untrained, had to depend on his native intelligence and personality. He was uniquely endowed so that people liked him, that made him a leader and brought him good outcomes, all manifested 30 years ago in a general commemorative tribute to his life. Times change, memories fade, and it's still worthwhile to present a unique individual who occupied a special place in Toronto's Jewish community. As an unskilled worker, JBS soon became aware of power issues, the vulnerability of the non-unionized worker, the political pressures, and the unreliability of divine intervention.
Sorry,
Departing
Irving,
from
just to interrupt you for one moment. Do you have a PowerPoint that you were trying to share?
am
We
I
don't-
not sharing it?
No, not yet.
Okay, I don't know what I can do to do it. I thought
Yeah,
I
can
had it.
you walk Irving through this and give him a hand?
Say brilliant. I hope that it's worth everybody's wait. I'll go through this a little quicker then.
Thanks.
Where am I? Just pointed out, as an unskilled worker, JBS became aware of lots of power problems and the vulnerability of the non-unionized worker, political pressures, and the unreliability of divine intervention. He departed from a strict religious commitment, but not from his parents. He joined the Pole Zion group that was young socialists and Zionists, and he became active in the Cap Makers Union, and he soon became its international secretary. In 1925, he fortunately married Dora Walensky, a beautiful, intelligent woman who became the admired director of the Toronto's Jewish Family and Child Service, an iconic service in the Jewish community to this day. Ironically, the Salsbergs had no children, and Mrs. Salsberg died in 1959. JBS never remarried. In 1926, he joined the Communist Party of Canada, CP. Biographers, of which there are many, have attempted to soften the significance of his membership out of affection for JBS and his reputation. I think that's an error. He joined when Soviet Russia was emerging as a significant power. He was a full-time CP. They paid him, directed his political campaigns. He was head of the trade union division and presumably its Jewish section. He took part in their ideological discussions and decisions. He declared differences, and he was kicked out of the party on occasion, but readmitted. Understandably, Stalin's endless purges, which took an anti-Semitic flavor, were a little difficult to accept. And Trotsky's assassination by an NKVD agent, deliberately sent all the way to Moscow, who after release from incarceration of decades, received a Soviet award for good work, was revolting. The Stalin-Hitler Pact of 1939, despite all the political explanations, was horrible. Despite all these measures, Salsberg stayed committed to the CP, regardless of his own misgivings or ruminations. The CP and JBS were criminalized in 1939 with the Soviet Nazi Pact, decriminalized by 1941. With the changing alliances, and the CP emerged newly named as the Labour Progressive Party of Canada, the LPP. JBS best functioned in legislative roles. Yes, he was twice elected as alderman in 1935-48, 3 times as member of provincial parliament from 48 to 55, all from Jew-rich Spadina riding. JBS had a constituency office in an old office building at College and Spadina. I describe Spadina in my abstract as a Champs-Élysées of Jewish Toronto, not so much physically as personality-wise. There were the iconic institutions, such as United Bakers, which is now located in a Lawrence Avenue open shopping plaza, Shopsy's Delicatessen, which is much diminished, a labor lyceum that was crowded with meetings, and across the street with Rothman's Menswear and Sammy Taft's Hats, the Homestead and Goldenberg's restaurant, which you can see somewhat in the back, and a little further down is the Victory in the Strand Theater. Hyman's bookstore was present, and other similar entities, all redolent of a past age and a culture which is being totally replaced just about by a variety of Chinese markets. Now, JBS would amble down Spadina. His Yiddish was, of course, perfect. He related to Hasidim and their concerns, no problem. Comrades approached him with summons in English that needed translation and response. Someone showed him an application for a dental school that needed a signature. Welfare source prevailed. He was available for help, always patient, reassuring. He was not called Mr., he was called Yossel. And here he was in his best element, reaching out to all, a true prototype of a successful politician who looked after the needs of his electors, and his legislative work was unparalleled. He introduced in provincial parliament effective anti-racist legislation regarding access to public places and the purchase of property, with general multi-party support when society tolerated insulting racist signs. The Cold War and its ongoing anti-Soviet animus really explained his loss as an MPP in 1955. In 43, Hitler, treaty or no treaty, invaded Russia and was immediately successful. Stalin created 5 anti-fascist committees: women, scientists, youth, Slavs, and Jews, with the purpose of stimulating financial and any other support for the Soviet Union's war effort, mainly from the United States of America. The Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was led by this gentleman at the mic, Solomon Michels, the director of Moscow's Yiddish State Theater, and included 14 other communists, including generals, poets, scientists, and doctors. In 1943, Michels and Pfeffer, a poet, were quite successful, appearing at a New York City meeting with Einstein and LaGuardia. And they were successful because it received $30 million in contribution. And they, by the way, stopped off in Toronto for a meeting with honorary sponsorship by then Lady Eaton on their way back to the USSR. As the Nazis were being pushed out of Russia, the specific Nazi murder of the Jews became apparent. The distressed survivors appealed to the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee for assistance, and while the committee's mandate really differed, its members were sympathetic, but they took things seriously, and the notion of the Crimea as a Jewish territory for survivors was discussed. A black book of Soviet crimes against Jews was edited by Ehrenberg and Grossman, 2 terrific Soviet journalists. But its publication was officially stopped by Soviet criticism of Jewish particularism. In 1948, Israel was established with Stalin's support. Since Stalin was anxious to see the British kicked out of the Middle East, Ben-Gurion looked to Truman for substantial support, and this presumably, undoubtedly, bothered paranoid Stalin, who began viewing Jews as part of an encircling threat, charging Jews as cosmopolitans and gearing up an anti-Semitic campaign. In 1948, Stalin ordered the murder by a simulated car accident of Solomon Michels, who was killed, buried with state honors, but depriving the Anti-Fascist Committee of its leadership. In 1949, Golda Meir, as Israeli ambassador, came to Moscow. Her appearance at a synagogue touched off an outpouring of 50,000 Jewish Muscovites. implying the recall of the Passover saying, quote, next year in Jerusalem, unquote. Molotov was the number 2 man in the Soviet Union. His wife, Polina, spoke to my ear in Yiddish, saying, quote, I am a daughter of the Jewish people, unquote. After being informed of all this, Stalin became berserk with anger and wished to kill Polina. He then contented himself with ordering Molotov to divorce his wife, which he did, and sending her to a gulag. In 1949, he ordered all members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, which he had organized, deposed from their positions, arrested, and jailed in Lubyanka prison. And if you want to get an idea of what occurred, this is a book, and it's a terrific accounting. Anyways, these people were all sent to Lubyanka prison, where they underwent repeat questionings and beatings at Stalin's direction. Took a personal interest. They were incarcerated for 3 years before coming to a trial in 1952 before military judges who acted as prosecutors without any defense lawyers. They were all charged with the guilty charges of Jewish nationalism and Zionism, all deemed anti-Soviet activities. They were all found guilty, punishable by immediate death by shooting, except Lena Stern, a renowned physiologist who had developed the blood-brain barrier and was working on an age longevity program of interest to Stalin. She, as well as the families of the slain, were all sent to the Gulag. The incarceration and the murder of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was hushed up, not made public. Inquiries were met with official reassurance and obfuscation. The American press
You've muted yourself, Irving. Do you mind unmuting, pressing the unmute button?
Am
Perfect.
I better now?
Yep,
Am I
got
okay
it.
now?
Yep, thank you.
Okay, sorry, I'm having lots of problems. Anyways, the Forvitz was hysterical with a demand for truth and the accusation of Soviet state murder. In 1953, Stalin died, and Polina was restored to Molotov by Stalin's heir as a gift to Molotov on his birthday. The Molotovs, and they're pictured here at an advanced stage, were never critical of Stalin. And the previous Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee guilty verdict was re-examined, reversed in 1955, a little late for the murdered committee members. JBS was approached by many, many people, including comrades, for what had happened to the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. And he arranged to speak in 1955 to Khrushchev directly to find out. I had known JBS since he, as my father, belonged to the UJPO. UJPO was a communist front social benefit organization. Even as a medical student, I used to go over to see provincial parliament in action, was close by. And I noted that JBS was treated with great respect. And in the 80s, he came to see me as a patient for the management of a benign condition that occurs in pipe smokers. And he loved to talk, which he did exceptionally well. And he wanted to tell me about what had happened. He explained that arranging such a trip to see Khrushchev required much doing at a local and Soviet level. He had been to Moscow previously, never could quite satisfy his need for definitive information. On this occasion, he was ushered in to see Khrushchev. Khrushchev was the head of the Soviet Union at this point. Khrushchev was busy receiving and making phone calls, making decisions, JBS felt like a little bit of a insignificant person from an insignificant communist country. Khrushchev was busy, irascible, repeatedly avoided dealing with JBS's questions about the anti-fascist committee. JBS was persistent, not to be fobbed off. Finally, exasperated, Khrushchev turned to him and in definite, unapologetic, defiant, irritated tone said twice, they were just Jews. In other words, what's the fuss about? What's all this doing? JBS immediately understood that the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee had been murdered and that Khrushchev was an anti-Semite. He had lots of proof. He then told me that he should have known better about their racism. In 1939, he had attended a communist course in Moscow directed by this man, Georgy Dimitrov, who was the head of the Comintern. They became social buddies. They enjoyed each other's company, a real bromance. And then he told Dimitrov, which he had to do, he was returning to Canada through Poland. Dimitrov forbade this, saying after heated discussion with JBS, quote, "You can't go there. You know what pigs the Poles are," unquote. It struck JBS that kind of remark shouldn't come from a high-level communist. But as a friend, he let it go and made no comment, but he still remembered the incident. In 1956, Khrushchev gave a secret speech to the Soviet Congress, denouncing Stalin and his murderous cult of personality, which was leaked throughout the world by the Mossad. On the basis of revealed Khrushchev's talk, the French and English Communist parties denounced Stalin. The Canadian Communist Party's leader, Tim Buck, who had been informed of all by JBS, who agreed that Khrushchev was an anti-Semite, was awaiting his orders from Moscow before making the, quote, correct, unquote, decision. This, JBS said to me, was the final straw. In 1957, JBS, after further speeches and after some more writing, and after 30 years, quit the CP or the LPP. As well, he withdrew from the United Jewish People's Order, and a third of his membership, including its president and my father, went with him. In 1959, they formed the new Fraternal Jewish Association. JBS was the obvious leader. And if you look at this group, which consisted of the executive, they were old, they were past their prime, and they couldn't attract younger members, and they were defunct in 10 years' time. The old LPPers became successful business types, and JBS also successfully sold insurance, and he became an ardent supporter of Israel.
2 minutes,
Well,
Irving.
I'm
Please.
sorry?
About 2 minutes, please.
It won't, I don't think it'll take 2 minutes. As well as a promoter for the use of Yiddish writing. Canadian Jewish News featured that. I called him later. He was irascible, not the kind of person I knew. He died at 96, is memorialized by an Israeli medical unit donated by his old Chaverim, and a township is named after him by Leslie Frost, his old premier, who also hired A. McLeod when he lost as MPP to write social work, social legislation. JBS was a humanist and still endures historically as a unique populist. If you can read Yiddish, he is described in this election poster as Ihre Beliebte, namely your beloved, a unique phrase on an election poster, a testimony to his community identity. JBS led a full, interesting life, but he may be too well remembered for a stirring eulogy of Stalin that he gave in provincial parliament at the urging of the LPP in 1953, which I'm sure he regretted seriously. Thank you very much, everybody. And sorry for all the interruptions.
No problem at all. Oop, there we are. Thank you very much, Irving. A tremendous PowerPoint. I'm glad that we got that up and running. So we still have about 20 minutes for questions. So I'm just going to sort of try to see if anybody has any questions. I see Bernie right away, and I know there's one also from David in the chat. So I'll let Bernie go first, and then we'll double back to David's question as well, or David, you can ask it as well. Thank you. Bernie, please, you're on mute right now.
Yes, I just unmuted. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation, Irving. As it happens, I am doing some work on the elections in St. Andrews and St. Andrew, St. Patrick as the two the two electoral districts were combined at one point. And I have to correct you, I'm sorry, on a couple of things. JB first contested St. Andrews in 19...
I didn't talk about that.
Yes, you said that he held the seat from 19...
Yeah, I didn't mention the name of a district though.
No,
It was always,
no.
I thought it was St. Andrews, wasn't it?
Yes, it was always St. Andrews, but he first contested it in 1937, and it was a very narrow loss to J.J. Glass by about 179 votes. But in 1943, he won, and that was the first time he was elected to the legislature in Ontario. Also, he lost in 1955, and it was a very hotly contested election. And he had suffered greatly because of his eulogy on the death of Stalin in 1951.
But the Cold War was going at that time. I'm sure that was a part of it as well.
Well, no doubt, but that got a tremendous negative reaction from a lot of people in the Jewish community. And the CCF was hot on his tail. And if you add the number of votes that JB received in 1955 to the CCF votes, it in fact is 800 votes more than Alan Grossman got, and Alan Grossman won the seat for the Conservatives. So that's just one thing that I needed to, I felt correct, that he held the seat from 1943 until 1955. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernie. Yes, and I think David, we'll let David Kaufman ask his question now, and then we'll see if David Ornstein would like to also do so after. David.
Well, thanks to all three of you for three really wonderful papers that really dovetailed nicely with one another. My first question is for Tyler. Tyler, I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about your claims about de-radicalization and your kind of centering of the narrative of these Jewish radicals on their post-radical lives. I found that very interesting because the historiography of Jewish radicals is really often on the radicalism itself, with a kind of emphasis on cheering it on. And they, of course, had much longer lives after that. So I wondered if you might speak to maybe not the narratives of their accomplishments in particular, but about what it might mean for you as a historian to think about the post-radicalization period as a kind of, subject for historical inquiry.
So I first started thinking about this with my first book on Edward Cecil Smith, who couldn't have been more white Anglo-Saxon Protestant if he tried. When I was trying to look at his whole life and why he went from being so communist, so desirous of putting his life on the line in Spain, like the stakes couldn't have been higher. And then 1940, Cold War happens and doesn't touch communism whatsoever. And unlike people like Salsberg and some other kind of famous examples that put on the record why they left, a lot of these people just kind of quietly stopped and made no declarations. And I've interviewed all the children. I've interviewed about 30, 40 children of members of the LRWP at this point. And it's an even split of people who, yeah, mom and dad told me about what they did and why. I had no idea what they did. It's never come up. And go away, how dare you accuse me of having a communist for a father. Pretty even split. And then some people who, within that, who actively talked about it, but nudge, nudge, wink, wink. I'm going to read you some of this Isaac Deutscher book about Trotsky's life, and that will be your bedtime story, but don't talk about this at school. So I think the big problem I'm confronting is you can't prove a negative without some sort of positive declaration of why I stopped. I'm left to infer that the fact they started to buy houses and cars and get new jobs and join the golf club had that de-radicalizing effect. But I don't think I'm ever really going to be able to prove it. But I think it's still something I see as worthy as pulling at the threads to figure out like how their lives changed, and mostly, almost exclusively for the better for these people.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Tyler. Thank you for the question. There's a question from David Ornstein that's actually probably a very interesting one, actually, for Irving. If you could sort of quickly turn to trying to answer, do you see whether you see a continuation from Stalin's anti-Zionism and today's anti-Zionism? I think broadly, or are we talking about Russia?
You know that. Obviously, I mean, and it was always around. I don't think it was unique to Stalin, although he really felt very vigorously about it. It's something that he shared with his daughter. He felt that the Jews were sick; they had a sickness. It was called Zionism, and they couldn't shake this notion of returning to their ancestral land. So that's how we viewed it, and I'm sure that is so. That your question is really your answer. Of course, I agree.
Thank you very much. Is there any other question here? If not, Tony has a question, actually, also for Irving. Tony writes, don't believe you mentioned Tulchinsky's 2013 bio of Salsberg. If you have any observations of that.
I've not read the book. I've read some of the material this is Tulchinsky. I recommended the book. I mean, I don't think he ever knew Salsberg, but he certainly knew all about him. And he had a real good feeling for the man. He really was very kind in his assessment. And I just want to add one thing about A.E. MacLeod, which I didn't have a chance to cover. A.E. MacLeod, and this is Salsberg told me this story, and it's been confirmed since. A.E. MacLeod he was an LPPer. He sat in the house with Salsberg. There were two men from the LPP. One was Salsberg and one was MacLeod. And he lost his seat, I think, in 1950 or something. But he told me that after he lost as MPP, MacLeod was hired by Leslie Frost to write social welfare legislation. And that was continued with the conservative premiers thereafter. And he was paid in a very unusual way. His name was never put on the books so that the press could ever put a point of finger at a communist working for the conservative government. He was paid as an agent. They let out printing contracts. The Ontario government bought printing, and he was the nominal agent. That's how they paid A. MacLeod.
Thank you.
I thought that was really fascinating. Anyways.
Yeah. David, did you have another question there? Was that, yeah, please go ahead.
This one's for Saundra. there was a big spike in sort of literary attention to the Soviet Jewry movement in the 80s. And then it seemed to have tapered off for a long time. I know there's a new book by Gal Beckerman, and so there's some gaining interest in it again. I'm wondering if you had any reflections on any of the uniquely Canadian characteristics, or perhaps have any insight about how the activities of these Calgary Jews may have been different or similar or unique in any way from the broader North American movement.
Well, from the reading I've done in terms of the American experience and broader Canadian experience, I would say it's not uniquely different. Other places have reported that it was the youth that sort of spearheaded things and pushed the more conservative establishment into action. So I don't think in terms of types of activities we were particularly unique, and a lot of activities were driven from national organizations sending out like brochures on how to do things. But I think what I think was fairly significant was the degree of activities, and there were just a number of people here that really pushed hard to get activities, to get people involved in this. And I'm sure that happened in other places as well, but I just thought there was a relatively significant degree of activity here. I haven't had a chance to compare it to what was going on in other cities, especially, it was hard. I mean, Edmonton is probably the closest city in the West that's of similar size. And I have a sense that more was happening here, but that's just a sense.
May I be permitted a follow-up question? I'm also very curious about what happens when Jews from the former Soviet Union migrate to Canada long after the Free Soviet Jewry movement is gone, and this sort of interaction of Jewish brethren, some of whom took on a advocacy or perhaps even mildly parochial role, and in their lives. I have a repair guy coming, knocking at the door. But I'd be curious to know if there's kind of if your study extends into the time when these folks actually emerge. I'm going to show my window, but I'm going to listen for your answer.
No, I mean, that's, I think, another piece of it. And there was so much material just going through the newspapers just to sort of recreate what was happening in the area during these years, that I just ended it there with in the late 80s and didn't get into the whole experience. I think the whole experience of the massive immigration from Russia, or former Soviet Union, into Canada and other countries is an area that has been discussed. When searching for Soviet Jewry, I encountered a lot of material talking about experiences of Soviet Jews once they arrived. I don't know how individuals who are very active in this felt when, well, certainly they were thrilled to welcome during the 80s when various dissidents got out of the country and they were able to meet with them. It was a very thrilling experience to these individuals so directly involved in this. And I was able to interview a couple of them that were here. And what was kind of cool is my own father was chair of the local committee, or co-chair of the local committee, and I didn't even know that. He never talked about it. So
thank you. It's so interesting. I mean, actually, if I can sort of like go back, I've got a question also for Tyler, but I kind of want to go back to the panel that David organized, David Kaufman organized yesterday, that sort of compared Canadian and Australian histories and historians, and I wonder if there's this sort of opportunity that has been overlooked, unless I've totally missed it. It's sort of like how to situate Canadian Jewry in respect to other empires. And in this particular context, we're talking about obviously the Russian Empire, and then the Soviet Empire and then the post-Soviet Empire, right? So it's, you know, how these ideas are circling. I'll ask my question really, really quickly to Tyler, and then I see David's hand up as well. I was curious, you mentioned that most of this material came from or some of this material at least came from basement archives. And so my question is, how did you know that the material might have been in those, or was it sort of, I mean, how did you initially come to the subject? And then how did you sort of go to these basement archives to find the subsequent material?
So it all started with after I finished my study on Canadians of the Spanish Civil War, and then a friend of a friend of a friend said, "Hey, would you like to meet a guy who's in Spain?" And I said, "Don't tease me. They're all dead." Jules Paveo had just passed away. He was the last Canadian in the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion. But Bill Crame, who was not in the international brigades, but was in Barcelona with the POUM, he was alive. He was 103 when I met him, and I went over to his house and I was told that there was a bunch of stuff in the basement that I could look at if I wanted to. And I did, and it was all on onion skin paper, and you're being real careful. And it took me forever to figure out, you know, this is the onion skin where you write horizontally and then you write diagonally to get the most bang for your buck out of the paper. And then found out, oh yeah, my mom was in this organization too. So were her two sisters. Do you want to talk to them? Yes, I would. And I just kept doing that until I have about 5 bankers boxes now of stuff. And then you can correlate it with things that are in the Ontario Jewish Archives, the Tenement in New York, some records that are held in Amsterdam and Barcelona and Moscow.
Excellent. Really, really interesting. Thank you. David Ornstein, please, David.
Well, thank everyone again. Just absolutely fascinating. So a bit of show and tell first, because that name sounds familiar when he said, and then I looked to my library, and here's one of his books. I think I actually met Crane in the 90s at a meeting of the Committee on Military and Economic Reform. And he does give credit that, unlike most economists, it says in the blurb, he actually has business experience. Now my question relates to the fact that I actually did happen to have this, and all of you used archival materials. And I'd very much like you to tell us more about the material nature of materials you found, including their internet available or maybe microform, and where else you think you might find primary materials for your topic.
Do you want me to start?
So please.
Well, I used a lot of newspaper reports. The Calgary Herald seemed excellent in reporting on the various initiatives that were happening. Also, the local Jewish newspapers that have been, the issues have been archived, or copies of them are available at the Jewish Historical Society of Southern Alberta. But also the Jewish Historical Society here keeps records from the various organizations. So looking at Hadassah files and at National Council of Jewish Women files, there were just flyers they had created, newsletter reports, just precious documents that had been maintained. I mean, there was, I think it's a note, I think they had a cookbook for Soviet Jewry. Just all these items, and just people saying, I have a button. I was part of a protest. The cool thing about looking for information for this is that because it happened not so long ago, there are still people very alive who were participants in it, right? The problem with some of the youth that were participants is it was a small event in their early life, and they didn't really remember much. But some of the, I guess, some of the participants I interviewed would be in their early 80s now, and had, for them, it was in their really formative early years, and they, as an adult, and they had strong recollections of what happened, and it really, I know one of them just donated a lot of papers, and I really encourage people to consider donating documents and papers, because if they're in someone's basement, I don't know how well they're being preserved and protected against flood and whatnot and fire. So for future research purposes, it's really invaluable to have these materials placed in an archive where they can be properly cared for and made available to people.
That's a supremely important point, Saundra. Thank you. I mean, yeah, our future career as historians, let alone our understanding of the past, depends upon that. So thank you so much. I don't know if Tyler and, oh, sorry.
I just want to say about digitization, like some of the newspapers are available digitally, which is great. But a lot of the archives I was working in are not yet available digitally. And because I was locally based, it was it was less of a need to travel around the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I don't know if Tyler or Irving would like to address this.
Well, first I'll say that the basement papers that I've inherited, where the families have agreed to it, they've all either made their way to the Ontario Jewish Archives, or I've been working with Ian Mackay to get them a home at McMaster, where some details to be worked out, but we're moving in that direction. So they are safer than they were, but they have not reached their final destination. In terms of digitization, there's been a lot of digitization of pamphlets and newspapers that has been extremely helpful for this research. I just wouldn't have been able to do it during the pandemic if I hadn't physically inherited boxes of documents and had access to those digital records. I would not recommend for anyone of a research strategy being, I sure hope I find people with stuff in their basements, because not every family, A, has it, obviously, and B, not every family wants to share it. There is a few families that don't want to let anyone view the stuff for a variety of reasons. In one case, it's because, how dare you accuse my dad of being a communist? Yes, I have boxes of stuff. No, you can't look at it. Just trust me, he wasn't. And in other cases, because there's a lot of intimate details in these letters. Like I said, 50-50 men and women, right? So a lot of these letters are half revolutionary, how we are going to be the vanguard, and half love letter. So families are not, so they'll like make copies and redact parts, and it gets weird. But that's an element of it too.
I just wanted to point out that I see that David Ornstein pointed out about a collection at the U of T archives. There are, of course, for material for people across Canada, and there may have been some people very active here locally, and then later moved and spent their time in other places. So of course there would be need to go somewhere else. But there's also, I found a fabulous interconnection in that there were certain dissidents that people here really fought hard for or adopted. And I found recordings done, telephone calls made out of the States to the same dissidents, and the recordings of the call were preserved in archives in the States. And so in this presentation I gave today is a shorter version of one I did for the Historical Society, and in there I actually used the clip out of the American archive showing the actual conversation with the dissident in Russia, in the Soviet Union. And that was kind of very cool to actually hear a conversation sort of live.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So there's, we'll let Irving have the last word on this if he wants to. And then after that, there was a really interesting, there's a number of really interesting comments being made in the chat if you want to follow that. And David Kaufman also added a link to an article or a piece in the Canadian Jewish Studies Journal about basement archives, which might be of interest to some of our viewers here. So Irving, I don't know if you'd like to comment on your archival collection, and then we'll close
My
up, I guess.
archival, I avoided it. That's why I thought that the appeal of my presentation, that it was a verbal communication. I got it from the horse's mouth, and one can't necessarily guarantee that was really truthful. That's the way he wished it to be interpreted, and that's what I repeated. That's really what I thought the paper was all about. His saying, he's describing what occurred. That's all.
Fascinating. Thank you. Thank you so much to all, obviously to this panel. Really, really interesting presentations that were tremendously interwoven. And I think obviously on that point, what we can do is we'll be closing our conference, our 2020, what year are we in? 2022 conference. And what I'd like to do just very quickly now is to obviously thank everyone who was involved in this, particularly Jesse Tufexis, who is the ACJS conference chair, who has done admirable work for a fourth or fifth year, I think it was, but a second consecutive online conference. Thank you, Jesse, for all your work. Thank you also to Theodora for all, Draper for all the technical support and excellent work there, as well as obviously all those who made this happen, including all our chairs, our panelists, our presenters. I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody, but there's got to be some sort of like Oscar exit music that'll play in a second. But I just wanted to also thank everybody who joined us over the last 3 days. It was really, really stimulating and interesting, and I personally learned a lot, and it's always tremendously valuable as an academic exercise, as a community exercise, as we all learn from one another. Next year, if all is right in the world, we will be meeting in person again in Toronto at York University. So we hope to see you there next year. And in the interim, if you ever have any questions, please feel free to reach out and get in touch with any of us at the leadership of the ACJS. I'll also remind you that the video, all of these sessions have been recorded, and these videos will be available on our YouTube channel, I believe it is, in the coming days, and will be available for a limited time for you to review and learn yet again. So once again, thank you very much to everyone for joining us. I wish you all a lovely rest of the day, and we'll talk soon. Thank you very much to all.